Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon to discuss Assessing Student Learning by Design, Principles and Practices for Teachers and School Leaders, which was published this spring by Teachers College Press. We are very fortunate to have with us here today the co-authors of the book, McTighe and Steve Ferrara. And I will just be sharing a couple of brief housekeeping items, and then I'll turn it over to Jay and Steve for this afternoon's presentation. First, there's a discount on the book available to participants of today's webinar. The details on how to obtain that are in the chat panel. So please look for those and get your copy of Assessing Student Learning by Design. If you have any questions for Jay and Steve, please feel free to ask those using the Zoom Q&A feature or the chat, and we'll do our best to get to those. We are recording this presentation and we'll share a copy of that recording with all the registrants via email. So please share that with any of your colleagues who are unable to join us today. And please say hello in the chat, introduce yourself, tell us where you're joining from. We're so glad to have you here with us this afternoon. Teachers College Press publishes all manner of books for teachers and teacher educators. So if you enjoy what you see here today, please visit our website, subscribe to our mailing list, and enjoy more book chats with Teachers College Press authors. And now to introduce themselves and their work, I will pass it over to you, Jay and Steve.
Great. Thanks, Emily. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Steve and I have a little more precise request in terms of sign on. It would help us and maybe you to know who's on the webinar today. So if you would be so inclined, if you're an elementary teacher, just put E in your grade level. If you're a secondary teacher, put M or H and a symbol for your subject area, such as WL for world language or M for mathematics. If you're a school administrator, A. If you're a district person, put a D and maybe a symbol for your role. If you're an other, let us know. And that just helps us know who's here. So welcome to all of you. Now, we want to introduce ourselves to you, and Steve and I are old friends, and both descriptors apply. We're friends and we're old. And we thought we'd have some fun with our pictures from the 70s. And I'm going to begin and introduce Steve, and he'll say a little about me, and then we'll get right into the webinar. So I've known Steve for a long time, and he's had a long career in education, beginning as a high school teacher, both involving with Head Start programs and special education. Steve went on to earn his doctorate from Stanford University. And I first met him at the Maryland Department of Education, where Steve came in as an assessment specialist and eventually the director of Maryland State Assessments. And this was in the 90s when Maryland had a very innovative state assessment. Our assessments were all performance-based. We had no multiple choice items on state tests for 9 years. Steve was heading up that effort. It was extraordinary, innovative, and had great influence for the good on teaching and learning. Following his tenure at the State Department of Ed, Steve has worked for several companies, but also been intensely interested throughout his career, not only in large-scale assessment, but in classroom assessment. He's done research, directed performance assessment projects for large organizations. He has published many articles, regularly speaks at the NCME, National Council of Measurement Education Conference, and he's just been a long-term friend and a very respected colleague. So that's Steve.
Jay, that was very flattering. Thank you for that. And I'm particularly flattered because of your biography, which I'm going to go over a little bit, which is totally impressive to me. And Jay, as well as being a friend, it has served as a model for me on how I operate as a professional communicator in education. And he also has an awesome beard and head of hair, which I no longer have. So Jay is a veteran educator, having served as a teacher, a gifted and talented resource specialist, a program coordinator, state director of gifted students programs, and an administrator for innovative programs at the Maryland Department of Education, including the Maryland Assessment Consortium, where he led a multi-year effort to develop performance assessments that all 24 school districts in the state signed on for and used for formative and interim purposes. Jay is an accomplished author. He's actually co-authored 18 books, which just blows my mind. And that includes, most particularly, the Understanding by Design series with Grant Wiggins, which is an award-winning and best-selling set of books, which I have used quite often in my work. His books have been translated into 14 languages, and he's written more than 50 book chapters, including a couple with me, which has been part of our both friendship and professional relationship. More than 50 books, book chapters, articles, and blogs. And he's been published in leading journals, including Educational Leadership, the ASCD journal, and Edutopia and Education Week, the weekly newspaper. Jay has an extensive background in professional development and is a regular speaker at state, national, and international conferences. Finally, he's made presentations in 47 states in the US, 7 Canadian provinces, and internationally in 38 countries on 6 continents. I'll make one last observation based on our personal relationship, which only some of you may appreciate. In addition to having that great beard and head of hair, he has a no-miss outside shot in basketball.
Thanks, Steve. And Steve and I played on adult basketball leagues during our heyday. All right,
Yep.
So enough about us. Here's our proposal for our relatively short time together. We want to give you some of the key ideas from our book. We include in our book a set of key underlying principles of effective assessment. We'll highlight a couple of those. The main thing we want to share with you is really the centerpiece of the book. We built our book around a 3-page assessment planning framework that we think can be used for any assessments, state, national, district, school, but especially classroom assessment, which is our focus. So we're going to briefly, at least, look at our framework and share some ideas that we hope will be of interest to you. As Emily said, we'll invite questions. You can drop questions in the chat, and we'll hopefully reserve some time at the end. So for anyone who wants to hang around, we can unmute and ask questions or put them in the chat.
Yeah, sure.
So there's a reminder for you. All right, I'm going to jump right in by starting with our fundamental assessment principle that begins our book. Here it is on the screen. This is a strong belief of both Steve and I. We think that the fundamental purpose of assessment should be to advance, support, promote learning. Now, clearly there are other purposes, and at the classroom, notably evaluation and grading is one of the reasons we use assessments. But our contention remains that this should be the #1 principle, and the main purpose is to improve, support learning, and that other purposes, including evaluation and grading, should not trump or interfere with this fundamental purpose. I like to think of assessment as a bridge between teaching and learning, and anyone interested in learning should, by definition, be interested in assessment. Because assessment helps us answer a fundamental question to teaching. Did they learn it? We may have taught it, but what did they get from our teaching? We may have covered it, but do they understand and can they use what we've taught? These are the answers that good assessment provides. Let me begin by showing you the first of our 3-page assessment planning framework. And hopefully the small type will still be visible on whatever device you're viewing it. As hopefully you can see, there are 3 columns in the first page of our framework, and the category headers describe the column. And we believe we start any thinking about assessment with goals or desired results. What do we want students to learn? And that becomes the basis for thinking about assessment. And that's column 1. The second and third columns, though, are also critical. What is the purpose or the purposes for an assessment? For whom are the results intended? Who is the target audience or audiences? And what information do they need? I'm going to make a few comments on the first column and then turn it over to Steve for further discussion. So in our book, we propose that there are, categorically speaking, 4 broad types of learning goals. These are interrelated, but they're not identical. And Clarity about these differences pays off for both teaching and for assessment. By the way, you can find these 4 types of goals embedded in standards documents. So they are standards based for sure. So let me highlight very quickly, and let's think about the assessment implication. One learning goal is knowledge. What do we want students to know? Facts and basic concepts fall into this category, and every subject has them. There are also skills and processes describing what we want students to be able to do. Everything from basic skills to more complex processes like problem solving, scientific inquiry, or the creative expressive processes of the arts as examples. A third goal type is one that Grant Wiggins and I have promoted, understanding. For us, an understanding goal is more than a fact. It's not just a skill. It's a conceptual understanding about a transferable idea and or process. And a fourth goal type we might refer to as habits of mind or dispositions. And these are also important in school and in life. But each of these has implications for how we teach and, in the case of our book, how we assess. Let me just give you a quick set of examples for each, but I think they should be familiar. Let me start with a non-education, unless you're a driver's ed teacher, example. Think about driving or learning to drive. There's knowledge that a beginner needs to know. Rules of the road, what the various car parts do, what to do in case of an accident, examples of knowledge. There are many skills involved in driving, parallel parking in the city, merging onto the highway, and God forbid, if you're learning on a standard shift, you got to master the clutch. And so a lot of skills to be developed. But there are also conceptual understandings in driving. Here are 2. Defensive driving. That's more than a fact, and it's not a skill per se. It's an understanding that you may be safe and practiced, but you're sharing the road with idiots who will do unexpected or dangerous things. So good drivers are not just about themselves. They're ever on the defensive, aware of what's around them. And finally, habits of mind. Here are 2 that I think apply to driving. Patience, especially when you're in traffic or you're running late. Courtesy, letting that truck in. It's been waiting for 3 lights because cars are impatient. These are habits, and they're important to driving. Let us look at some more academic examples of the same goal types and be thinking about the assessment implications. There are many examples. Knowing your multiplication tables in mathematics, or knowing the capitals of states, if that's important in social studies, would be examples of knowledge. Skills. My wife and daughter are art teachers, so the ability to draw from observation is a skill that they teach. I used to be a swimming coach, so teaching how to swim the backstroke effectively and efficiently is a skill. Now think about the assessment for those. If I want to assess if you know your math facts, an objective test or quiz will let me know that, because knowledge, if you think about it, is binary. You know it or you don't. Objective tests and quizzes let us know if students know things. But for skills, in many cases, the best assessment of a skill is to let the student do the skill. And thus we can gauge their proficiency level along a continuum from novice to expert. So a performance-based assessment is the norm for skills. What about understandings? These are more abstract and yet important. Our view is that to assess for understanding, in many cases, we need more than just an answer. We need the student to either apply their learning to show they understand and can transfer it, and or we need explanation of why they made their choice, or why they are making this argument. What's their reasoning? And habits of mind. Those of you familiar with Common Core math standards know that perseverance is one of the math practices. Skepticism is at the heart of critical thinking. These are important habits that we want to cultivate in school, but they don't lend themselves to traditional tests. We're not going to have a test of skepticism on Friday, but we can gather evidence of even these habits of mind. by developing observable indicators and being on the lookout for them in students and having students reflect and self-assess for themselves. So to summarize, assessment thinking starts with goal clarity, and clarity about these different goal types informs and guides our thinking about the evidence that we need from assessments. Let me turn it over to Steve to make some comments about the second and third columns in our framework.
Thank you, Jay. Right, so the idea is, and the comments I'm going to make apply specifically to your classroom formative assessment practices as educators. In fact, these ideas, these key questions apply to design and development of statewide assessments, the kind of thing that I work on every day, almost every day. So once you've started with what are the desired learning results that you want to assess, you next want to be clear on why it is you're going to assess those learning results, whether they be knowledge, skills, and processes, and so forth. So in the second column of this, the key question framework, you see a considerable list of purposes for assessment. Many of them are summative, such as, or evaluative, such as gauge program effectiveness down at the bottom of the list, or provide accountability data like we do on district and statewide assessment programs. As far as classroom assessment is concerned, you may have purposes for assessing your students in the classroom, such as informing and guiding your own instruction, making decisions about whether the kids got it, whether you need to reteach something, whether you can move on, and also to communicate to the kids about what your learning expectations are. Meaning, if you want to make sure that kids understand that you want them to develop conceptual understanding so that they can apply their understandings and explain them, then you have to make that your purpose and assess in a way that communicates that purpose. Now, over in the right-hand column, the audiences for assessment. Again, we've been comprehensive, and we've given you a long list of audiences for assessment, specifically assessment information. And your audience may be yourself. You want to find out how well kids did on that instructional unit that you think you've just completed. And so your purpose is to evaluate how well they've done so you can make decisions about further instruction and perhaps assign grades. In classroom assessment, I would suggest that I think the primary audience for most of your the assessment information you produce is either for yourself for making those decisions, or for the students themselves, so you can tell them how well they've learned and what their subsequent learning needs are and what they can do about that. Thank you, Jay.
So as Steve indicated, the second and third columns in this page were meant to be comprehensive, i.e. they could be used by state level policymakers as well as classroom teachers. Permit me to show you a more specific classroom-based slide that looks at three distinct, but again, related purposes for classroom assessment. And both Steve and I are longtime friends with Dr. Rick Stiggins, maybe one of the great leaders, and not maybe, certainly one of the great leaders in promoting assessment literacy and classroom assessment ideas around the world. And Rick has indicated a useful distinction that he calls there are assessments for learning, specifically ones that are used as pre-assessments or diagnostically right in the beginning of instruction, and then ongoing formative assessments. And he calls these assessments for learning as distinct from assessment of learning, which is typically summative in nature. And Steve and I like to use the term evaluative. The purpose of assessments of learning is to step back and see what kids can do on their own, what they know. And it's the basis for evaluation and grading. And that's a part of our world. So we found these distinctions useful, and permit me to highlight a couple of points in each of the three purpose types. Diagnostic, or sometimes known as pre-assessments, are things that teachers do at the beginning of new instruction, certainly at the beginning of the school year, and often at the beginning of every major unit, to find out where kids are, what knowledge do they already have. If it's a skill-based instruction, what's their skill level to start? And to me, one of the important aspects of pre-assessment is trying to ferret out any potential misconceptions that students have coming in. And we know, especially in science, students often harbor misconceptions that can be very difficult to break. Because we know the most important factor in learning something new is prior knowledge, it's really imperative that we find out what students know or think they know before we start layering on new information. And if students come in with a misconception, such as, well, if it's in a book, it must be true, or I saw it on the internet, so I must believe it. We want to catch those early and not find out on the end of unit test that they had a misunderstanding all along. So there are a variety of pre-assessment techniques and tools which we've described in our book. Formative assessment is at the heart of assessment for learning. As Steve said, these are the assessments we use along the way to inform our practice. In fact, the word formative can be thought of as informing both us as teachers and informing students, giving feedback to learners to help them improve. And this is where the teacher's role is not only an instructor, but a coach. Coaches are master feedback givers. That's what they do in practice. And finally, evaluative assessment is the point in time when the student has to perform, and we're going to judge how well they've learned a body of knowledge. I've recently come across a British educator named Will Claxton, and he offers a distinction I find useful. He said, there's a learning mode, and then there's a performance mode. The learning mode is where diagnostic and formative assessment needs to flourish to promote the best learning. But ultimately, we're asking students periodically to perform, and that's where the evaluative assessments come in. It's like the game in athletics. We have practice, which is practice and feedback, but ultimately you're going to perform and we're going to judge your performance. So that's just 3 types that we've described in our book. So I'm going to set up the second page and Steve will talk about some methods, but one of the principles that underlies our choice of assessment methods is this one. Psychometrically, and Steve's doctorate really speaks to this, psychometrically, we know that any assessment, any measure is prone to measurement error, whether it's a state assessment or classroom assessment. And therefore, we can minimize the effect of measurement error. We can increase our ability to make inferences by collecting more information, more evidence than less. Analogously, we like to think that good assessment should be thought of as a photo album, not a snapshot. A snapshot might be a moment in time quiz or an end of unit test or a performance task. And certainly those give us information about what students know and understand and can do. But a single picture, a single snapshot is often incomplete. And if any of you have ever been at a party or a gathering and someone takes a cell phone picture and you look at it and you go, oh, please don't share that one. You caught me at a bad moment. Same thing with testing. We know that sometimes assessments aren't revealing the true or the complete knowledge of a learner. But if we have a variety of assessments over time, we have better evidence from which to make sound judgments about learning. The other part of the analogy I'll touch on briefly is because we have different goal types, we should see different types of photos in our assessment albums, right? So we might have multiple choice tests or true false to assess knowledge or basic skills, but we might also have some performance-based assessments to get at application, evidence of understanding, and even habits of mind will be revealed as students work on performance tasks and projects. I mean, think about it in terms of the driver's test, right? There's a written test, which is appropriate source of evidence for some things, but there's also a driver's test because driving is inherently a performance-based activity. And it would be ill-advised to give a license to someone who could just pass a written test, but it could not drive. So similarly, we advocate making sure that our assessments align with our goals and that we have a variety of evidence over time to get a more complete picture of what students know, can do, understand. So that's a setup to the second page in our framework, where we explore and lay out a set of assessment methods by which we can get evidence of learning. And I'll turn it over to Steve to comment on this page.
Thanks, Jay. So you notice that there are 5 columns in this framework of assessment methods, and they're organized into 2 sections. So in the left-hand column, we've listed out various types of selected response items. And these are the ones that are familiar, especially from the statewide assessments that all of your students participate in, if you're public school educators in the US, of course. And there are other kinds of selected response items that you may use in your classrooms, such as true, false, and matching items. And also in more recent times, especially in large scale state assessments, we've seen items that are called technology enhanced items that involve using hotspots and dragging and dropping answers to match things to questions and so forth. So those are the selected response item methods of assessment. Over on the right, there are 4 columns that we have organized under performance-based assessments. And that includes constructed response items, products, performances, and what we call process-focused assessments. So if we start with constructed response items, there the idea is, the name is fairly self-explanatory, where the student is going to generate something in response to an assessment, to an item, to an assessment activity. In state assessments, it's typically short constructed response items. In your classroom, it may be things like you may ask students to write a short answer paragraph on an issue that you've posed for discussion in the classroom. And product assessments include things where students are producing something larger than a short constructed response, such as an essay, a research paper. Perhaps you've asked them to write a story or a play. If you're a science teacher, a product assessment would be a lab report. I'm going to give specific examples of linking these assessment methods to purposes of assessment, but let me just finish going through the framework. So that was product assessments. Performance assessments include things like oral presentations. It might be a debate or a science lab demonstration or a dance and so forth. And finally, process-focused assessments. That's where you're acting as a diagnostician to check in with students to check their thinking processes, whether they are developing conceptual understandings, whether they are developing the kinds of habits of minds that you want to inculcate in the way they think about their learning and think about their work. Now, for some examples, and this, we believe that the animations are a little messed up here. So what I'd like to
actually, Steve, I don't think they're going to come.
Okay, all right. So if I'll ask you to, I want to link purposes of assessment to some of these methods. So if you look in the constructed response column, let me get this right, under show your work, which is in the middle of the column. The idea there is your purpose for asking students to show their work, say in a math class where you're teaching them a new procedure and you ask them to show their work. Your purpose there may be to check the accuracy of the procedures they're following that you've just taught them. Or in another case, say in social studies, you're checking their conceptual, you want them to show their work because you want to check their conceptual understanding of something like products and services in the economy. If we move over to the product column, And we can use the example of a portfolio, which is just past the midway point in the column. You might use a portfolio in your classroom for students to document their development of knowledge and skills in a particular content area over the course of the school year, so that they can demonstrate to themselves, to you, and to their families how they've developed knowledge and skill and so forth in a content area, and where they are at the moment when they finally complete the portfolio and they're not making any more entries. So that's the purpose of using a portfolio as a product assessment. When we get to the performance assessment column, I'd like to use the example of an oral presentation where you may ask students to give a 2-minute oral presentation on something you've been working on in the classroom to check their progress, their development of conceptual understanding. Or perhaps they've been working on a project and you want them to do an oral presentation of the class to see how far along they are in accomplishing the goals of the project towards final completion. Finally, to that last column, where you're acting as an investigator on student learning, as a researcher, in fact, as a teacher researcher, as many people in my field like to talk about. I use the example of oral questioning, where in the midst of a discussion in the classroom with your students, or perhaps presenting instruction to the students, you may use a series of oral questions that you pose to the entire classroom, or by calling out individual students. And you may do that to just make sure they understand the last couple of minutes of discussion, to make sure they're developing the concepts that you're trying to convey, or they understand the procedures that you're teaching to them. So the point of this part of the framework is, I think, there's this really considerable array of assessment methods that you have available to you that you can choose given the learning outcomes that you want to assess and the information that you want to provide to your students about their learning and learning needs. And that's why I've connected these various methods to purposes of assessment. Thanks, Jay.
Great. And you'll notice at the top of each page in gray, there are key questions, and Steve just summarized. The choice of assessment methods is based on the answer to the questions on the first page. What are the learning goals? What are our purpose or purposes? Who are the audiences? What information do they need? Let us take a look at the third column, or the third category. But I want to highlight a third principle that we've described in our book, the principle of alignment, which is a point that Steve just made. Here is something that we've observed in our long careers. Sometimes what's being assessed in classrooms is not fully aligned to all the goals that we espouse, or even the standards espouse. The cartoon makes a humorous but also serious point of at least one case of mismatch. Here's a quick example. Social studies standards say that one of the goals in social studies and history is to help kids develop critical thinking ability and the ability to critically appraise historical claims. But what if we looked at classroom assessments in history or social studies and saw that it was primarily test of facts about historical periods? No critical thinking required. All you have to do is know the facts, and through multiple choice methods or true false format, for instance. In that hypothetical case, there would be a mismatch between at least one of our goals, critical thinking, and something that's important. One of our favorite questions is a rhetorical question. Are we assessing everything that we value, or everything that the standards call for, or mostly the things that are easiest to test and grade? And that for us is an important question to consider. All right, so as our time winds down and we want to have some time for questions, we're going to look at the third column, third page here. I'm going to highlight the three columns, and then Steve and I are engaged in some back and forth conversation about them. So in this column or this page, the first column looks at evaluation methods. When an assessment is open-ended, or even if it's not, we need to have some basis for judgment. So that's the first column. The second column is an interesting one. Who will be involved in evaluating student performance? In 99% of the cases, arguably it's the teacher, but we think there's some virtue in considering possibilities for some other roles for evaluation. And finally, and importantly, how will we communicate results? What are the options we have? And again, it relates to purpose and audience. So let me go to the first column of evaluation methods. And the first part of this, I think, is straightforward. When we have tests and quizzes or assessments in general that are assessing knowledge or basic skills, and there's a single correct answer, as we know, we can use an answer key, or if we have access to it, we can run it through a Scantron type machine, or we apply a scoring template because there's a single correct answer. But when our assessments are more open-ended, skill assessments, performance-based assessments, etc., process-focused assessments, we need some basis for judgment. And in the category below, we have several different types of scoring or evaluation tools. Now, Steve, I know you've done an awful lot of work with performance assessment, both at the state level and in classroom assessments. So talk to us a little bit about some of the tools that are available for performance-based evaluation.
Yeah, Jay, I'm going to talk about two. I love talking about this. So one thing to say is what is widely known is scoring rubrics. And there are various kinds of rubrics, including generic rubrics and task-specific scoring guides. The point about scoring rubrics is, as you know, if you Google things like scoring rubrics, you'll get hundreds and hundreds of examples that you can consider for your own use. And what's valuable there is that you can develop your own rubric or align it with the purpose for your assessment activity and the information that you want to convey to your students about their learning and their learning needs. But whether you start with the rubric, which some people advocate, or whether you start with the assessment activity, I use that generic term to think of a test item, or it could be a performance task, but whether you start from the assessment activity or the scoring criteria, whether it be a rubric or a correct or incorrect scoring key, the key thing is that you develop the scoring criteria simultaneously with the assessment activity, and you assure 100% that those things are perfectly aligned with each other and convey the information that you intend to convey to your student and other people about student learning and learning needs. So you don't just develop assessment activities, you develop them along with, or you select the scoring criteria that you're going to use, and you use the scoring criteria to convey things to students about how well they're doing, what else they need to do. I'll make one other observation, Jake. I know I'm being long-winded, so I'll try to be brief. If you look down at the rating scale example, the third bullet under performance-based assessment, often it's not necessary to use a somewhat complex and sometimes difficult to apply scoring rubric. A simple rating scale can do the trick. So in that previous example I gave, if you ask someone to give a brief oral presentation to demonstrate the conceptual understanding in social studies, you could use a simple rating scale that could be it could be bipolar, no pun intended there, meaning you're clear, or you got it or you didn't get it, or it could be hierarchical, as in you sort of got it, you're on your way to full understanding, or you've demonstrated complete understanding. So in addition to using scoring rubrics, you can convey very useful formative feedback to your students using rating scales.
Yeah, great point, Steve. And by the way, the increasingly popularized use of, quote, single point rubrics are for that purpose of feedback and having students self-assess. And they're not as complex or layered as more fully blown rubrics. I want to just return to the first point Steve made, and this was an insight that I got late in my career. I didn't have this right away, but it was Steve and Grant Wiggins that helped me see it. The criteria to use for evaluation is more a function of your goals than of the particular assessment that you have. In other words, you should be able to infer or derive from your goals the success qualities or the criteria for judging their success. And that helps to avoid something that we often see, particularly with performance assessments, that sometimes teachers and often students will fixate on the surface features of a product or performance and miss the inherent content that it's meant to assess. A classic case in point are science fair display boards, where the kids spend more time decorating the board than highlighting the science. And they think that the more attractive board will get a better score. Our criteria should not highlight neatness, creativity, and spelling. If it's a science project, it should emphasize the science. I'm going to take a departure from this page for just a moment to show you a practical set of tools that go back to our first principle. Remember, assessments should support and promote learning, not just measure it. So here is something that I've developed, and this is a rubric. It's an analytic rubric, 3-point scale for a graphic display of data. Students might be given data and asked to graph it, or they might collect data from a survey, and now they're going to show what they found through a graphic display. But look carefully, and you should notice 2 graphic additions to this rubric that can turn it from simply an evaluation tool the teacher uses to something greater. First of all, notice in each cell, there's a little box, and at the bottom, there's a rectangular section. Here's how this could be used. This is how you can transform an evaluation tool into something richer that supports learning. The idea of the little box is when a student is working on their data display, before they turn it in, they're asked to self-assess. So Jay, look at your display and see how you think you did according to our rubric. Or you might exchange it. Maybe I'll give my display to Steve and ask him to give me feedback. How does he think I've done? And so you do the check boxes. So it might look like something like that. You know, Steve points out to me that I didn't use a graph and my graph is uneven. And in fact, I can't make sense of it because the scale has been perverted by the fact that it's not even. So it's more than just neatness, in other words. The second use of this is when you return the rubric with your evaluation to the student, you ask them, based on your feedback, to identify at least one action that they're going to take next time they do a graphic display of data, or a goal that they have to improve their persuasive writing, etc. And this becomes an expectation. So what we have here is an evaluation tool that can give us more. It supports self and peer assessment, and it encourages students to make use of feedback. So I wanted to share that with you. Here is a version of this same idea for primary grade children. The format is for self-assessment, and there's a place for them to identify at least one thing that they're going to try to do next time to improve.
Right.
All right, so we're going to finish up looking at our last page, and then we'll have a little time for questions if you have them. I'm going to make a quick comment here and then ask Steve to jump in on the communication feedback methods. Again, the majority of evaluation is done by the teacher in the classroom, of course, but I always encourage considering possibilities for when you might open up the evaluation to a wider group. My daughter Maria taught at High Tech High School in San Diego, California. Some of you know High Tech High is one of the preeminent project-based learning schools in the country. And I can tell you from her 4 years there that every one of those major projects were evaluated by a group of adults, a panel of adults, including experts in the field where the project resided. And I can tell you from my daughter's experience and from my visits to the school, kids took it very seriously when they're presenting for a quote, real audience outside of the teacher. Again, you can't do this all the time. It may be difficult to orchestrate, but I always encourage teachers to think about, particularly for performance-based assessment, the possibility of bringing in a real audience. And even if the audience isn't formally evaluating, just providing feedback, it often brings a realism and a motivation to students. And so it's something that we just wanted to put forth in this column. All right, we're going to wrap up by looking at column 3, and I'll let Steve jump in here.
Thanks, Jay. So I think I've mentioned a couple of times the idea that when you're thinking about what learning outcomes you intend to assess, the method that you're going to use to assess them, including the scoring criteria. I also mentioned in conjunction with all of that, the assessment information that you intend to convey to students and other people, their parents and so forth. And that's what this last column is about. It's the methods you're using to communicate to students and others how well they've learned and what their learning needs are. So it's feedback as well as communicating summative results. So obviously you can use letter grades when you assign letter grades to a student's homework, or at the end of a quarter, you're conveying you're giving them feedback about how well they've done, and there's an implication there about whether they need what things they may the fact that they may need to improve. You can also use scoring rubrics to do the exact same thing, but with much more detail. So when I referred earlier to generic and task-specific rubrics, and you can use the scoring rubrics not only to evaluate the qualities of a piece of work or a performance that students have produced. You can also, the information also conveys how well they've done and gives an indication of what they need to do to get the next higher score on the rubric. Finally, I think we gave an example of using well, you can use a checklist to indicate neatness, accuracy, and so forth of, for example, a visual display. So the idea is, consistent with everything we've set up to this point, everything should be aligned from what it is you're going to assess, the method for assessing and scoring the quality of the response to the assessment, and your communication methods for conveying how well students have done and what they may need to do next to improve their performance. Everything's aligned.
So here are our rhetorical questions for this third column. How are we currently communicating for various purposes and audiences, and how well is our communication working? Are there ways we might improve our communication and feedback system to parents, students, peers, and ourselves? And much of the work that I see going on around the country in, quote, standards-based grading is meant to answer that question, with a recognition that often traditional grading merges several factors into a single grade: student achievement or performance, work habits like doing homework or completing assignments or participating in class, and sometimes teachers factor in progress, how much a student has grown. The problem that's evident is if teachers mix multiple factors into a single grade, the grade itself loses its communication meaning. You know, 3 kids could get the same grade for very different reasons. So standards-based grading, one of its principles is we're going to grade performance against standards based on acceptable assessment evidence. And we're going to separate out those other factors and report on them separately. Because look, work habits are important. Progress is worth noting. But if we mix them, the communication system is corrupted because we don't know what percentage for a given kid is progress, achievement, or work habits. So there's a lot more to say about grading communication, but we describe much of this in our book, and we hope it'll be useful. So our time is about up for our presentation, and it looks like from my clock, we have about 8 minutes left in our hour. And I'm going to see, first of all, if Emily has any questions that have come in that we might have missed. Otherwise, let us just open the door for questions. And I guess we would start by inviting them in the chat box, just so we don't have multiple people talking at once. Or Emily, if there are any questions that you've received,
Sure. There's a question here in the Q&A panel. Can
Okay.
you speak to the use of technology for product performance or process-focused assessments, recommendations, tools, insights, etc.?
I'll take a crack at that, and Steve will have some things, I imagine, as well. Let's start with performance-based assessments. I like to propose that a good performance-based assessment should have at least two components, very overtly, explicitly. There's an application component where student is performing with their learning as much as possible in authentic, realistic situations. And secondly, there's a communication component. Students have to explain what they've done, justify their position, reveal their reasoning, support their argument. And so on the first side, any performance that students are doing, if it is linked to a learning goal that is either has a technology component or could benefit from it, we can bring in technology into the mix. I'll give you a quick example. There's a wonderful resource called Tuva Labs, TUVA-LABS. And Tuva Labs has a wonderful collection of data sets, number one, and data analysis tools that are technology-based tools that students can use to make sense of and help interpret data. And so if there are any tasks that involve data collection and analysis, using one or more of the tools from Tuva Labs would be a great and natural use of technology to that task. On the communication side, clearly there are many ways which students can use technology to communicate. I have a friend who's a high school English teacher who regularly has kids tweet. They set up a class Twitter account, and he asks them to tweet in 288 characters about the key idea or their interpretation of this passage, or their evaluation of an author's style. So they're using technology in a brief, constructive response way, and it's very, very rich.
Jay, there's an awful lot to say here, but I'd like to leave time for at least one more question. I'll say briefly that your district or your school could contract with various companies like MZD Development that provide full service online tools for developing, delivering, and scoring performance assessments. And there are other groups like that that offer them. I just happen to think very highly of the people at MZD Development. Another example is if you're interested in project-based learning, there's PBL Works, and you can buy all of their content, all of their many projects, well-developed and vetted projects for use at the elementary, middle, and high school levels. And the subscription is about $80 a year. And it's delivered online, is the point.
Yeah, and those project-based learning assessments or projects are outstanding. That's the gold standard.
Yep.
I'm seeing a good question from Stephen. Can you tell us about effectively approaching teachers to change their assessment practices? Wow. That's an important question. I'll give you my 2 cents. The theory of change that Grant Wiggins and I have always followed is people will not be inclined to change practice unless they see a compelling reason to do so. Moreover, the incentive to change assessment practices has to outweigh the pain or the costs of making change to something that may be comfortable, albeit maybe recognized as inadequate. One of the things that I have done, and I have an article about this, and if Emily, if I send you the article, you can send it out to people. The article is called 3 Questions on Measuring Learning. And in the article, I describe an exercise that Grant Wiggins and I have done. It's a short exercise, and you can do it in a faculty meeting or at a PD day or with a team of teachers, a PLC team. And in a nutshell, the intent is to set up a recognition that the qualities of good assessment may in fact be a little bit out of sync with some of our regular assessment practices. So what we do in the exercise is set up a gap between a desired state and have people reflect on current practices. And my experience is, if you can set up that gap, if you can set up a need to make change and see that it is worthwhile, you're more likely to get teachers to buy into trying some new practices. Yeah. Mandating it or just saying standards-based grading is the latest thing, so you all do it, is not likely to convince everyone, particularly veteran teachers. Yeah. So, but that exercise is really interesting and practical. And in a nutshell, it asks people to think about their own life and learning experiences and think about a time when assessment, when whatever situation they're thinking about, significantly contributed to their learning. And then they have to tell the story. We do this in small groups about each person's experience and how assessment helped them. Noteworthy, many of the examples that people cite are not from traditional schools. They're from learning to golf or a hobby or maybe in the military. But what evolves, so then they share their stories and they develop a generalized list of characteristics of assessments that promote learning. And almost every time I've done this, the list that emerges becomes a list of here's what our assessments can and should be. And now we compare them to where we are currently. And we have very specific things that we can do to make our assessments more impactful. The article gives examples from the exercise, and that would be a way I would proceed to try to entice teachers to recognize that there's work to be done very often in our assessment practice.
Jay, I'll acknowledge the wisdom in what you said. People aren't going to change unless they see a compelling reason to change, and add one thing. Helping teachers change their assessment practices means you can't ask them to do it on their own. They need peer support and leadership to support to change those practices.
Yeah. And Mary Ann, as a world language teacher, I have an excellent resource for world language teachers. And if you email me at j@mctigheassociates.com/associates, I'll send that to you. Just remind me of world language resource. I'm happy to stay on. I think Steve is happy to stay on if anyone wants to remain and has a question. But since our time is about up, we want to thank you for joining us. We hope you'll be inclined to want to look at our book, which goes into a lot more depth on these things. And want to thank Emily and Teachers College Press for both publishing our work and for letting us take part in the webinar. So I'll turn it back to Emily for our, oh, and Steve, jump in with.
I just want to say thank you for attending to this. I have to apologize. I'm going to have to step off for another meeting. So Jay, it was great working with you as always. And Emily, thank you for hosting us, and thanks everyone for joining us. Take care.
Yeah, see you,
Thank
Steve.
you, everyone. Bye-bye.